Lesson 30. Third conjugation, verbs in I-O, the ablative of manner. Hi everyone, welcome back to Lenny's Latin class. Today we're on page 90 in lesson 30, and thankfully this lesson ought to be much shorter than the last one. Okay, we have two things to talk about. That's the third conjugation I-O verbs, and then the ablative of manner. So let's jump right in and begin with third conjugation I-O verbs. As you already know, in Latin we have four conjugations: the first, second, third, and fourth conjugations. In the first conjugation, the infinitive ends with are, like laudo, laudare. In the second conjugation, we have ere at the end of the infinitive. Therefore, moneo, monere. In the third conjugation, we have a short e near the end, 3 letters from the end of the infinitive. So that's rego, regere. And then in the fourth conjugation, the infinitive ends with ire. So audio, audire. When we think of verbs that end with io in the first person singular, we generally think of fourth conjugation verbs. We have verbs like audio, servio, and also venio, which means come. And so each of these verbs ends with io in the first person singular. Then the infinitive, that's the second principal part, also known as the present active infinitive. I just call it the infinitive for short. For those fourth conjugation verbs, the infinitive ends with ire. So in the fourth conjugation, the first person singular form ends in io, then the present infinitive ends with ire. Okay, that's the pattern. What we're learning about today is that there are a few verbs that are technically part of the third conjugation that end with io in their first person singular form. But they don't have an infinitive in ire, like fourth conjugation verbs. They are still technically part of the third conjugation, but the letter I gets squeezed in there in certain places. So we call this special group of verbs third conjugation I-O verbs. So you can think of this set of verbs as a sort of a subset of the larger group of verbs known as third conjugation verbs. Okay, so let's read section 249 together. It says, a few verbs of the third conjugation end in I-O, that is, in their first person singular form. They are conjugated like rego, except that they have I before blah, blah, blah. And now they tell us some of the different places where we find a letter I where we would not expect to have one. So look at the very end of section 249. You'll see a sample verb, and that's the verb copio. That's an example of a third conjugation I-O verb. So here are the four principal parts: copio, capere, capi, captum. We have related English words like captive and capture. Okay, it means to take. So here's what I want to point out. At first glance, if you're new to Latin, you might look at it and say, copio, oh, that's a fourth conjugation verb, right? But then you look at the second principal part, and if it were from the fourth conjugation, you would expect the present infinitive, that is the second principal part, you would expect it to be capire, C-A-P-I-R-E. So if you only look at the first principal part, copio, you might be tricked into thinking it's fourth conjugation because of the I-O ending. It looks like it's from the fourth conjugation. But it's really not. It's third conjugation. You can look at the present infinitive, the second principal part, and see that it has a short E, 3 letters from the end, just like every other third conjugation present infinitive. The pattern here is copio, capere. A few years ago, I read one of the ancient Roman grammarians named Donatus. And Donatus wrote a short work called Ars Minor, and it's a brief work on Latin grammar. And so the way he presents the Roman verb system is with only 3 conjugations. As far as Donatus is concerned, the conjugations have to do with the connector vowel between the stem and the personal ending. So the way Donatus presents it is that the first conjugation is the one that has an A before the personal ending. The second conjugation is the one that has an E before the personal ending. And the third conjugation, which encompasses what we call both the third and fourth conjugations, he groups those both together into what he calls the third conjugation and says that, well, they're all the same because they have the letter I before the personal ending. And if you think about it, he's right. Both third and fourth conjugation verbs have the letter I before the personal ending. So in the modern world, the way we look at Latin grammar, the way we describe it and categorize it, is often different than the way the ancient Romans did it. Okay, so Donatus viewed it as having 3 conjugations. We view it as having 4 conjugations, apparently because of the infinitive. That's the second principal part. So in addition to these 4 conjugations that we have, there's also this subset of third conjugation verbs known as third conjugation IO verbs. And so that's what we're looking at today. So now that we know what we're looking at here, let's take a look at some of the specifics of the different forms we get from a third conjugation IO verb. So let's take another look at section 249. Again, it says a few verbs of the third conjugation end in IO. They are conjugated like rego, except that they have I, and now they're going to tell us where the letter I shows up. They have I before O and U in the present indicative, and also before A and E in the imperfect indicative, future indicative, present subjunctive, present participle, gerund, and gerundive. So we're going to get the letter I squeezed into lots of places where we would not expect it for a third conjugation verb. So turn, if you will, to page 268 in the back of the book, and we'll see a complete paradigm or a chart for the verb copio. Things that are formed from the infinitive, that is the present active infinitive, the second principal part, the things that are formed from that particular infinitive are going to look as you would expect them to look for a third conjugation verb. The imperfect subjunctive, for example, is formed from the present infinitive. We take the present infinitive and we add endings to it. So if you look at the right-hand column here, at the subjunctive column under imperfect, we have caperim, caperes, caperet, caperimus, caperatus, caperint. So we don't get the letter I there because those things are formed from the present infinitive. So move over now to the left column, that's the indicative column, and go down to where it says perfect tense, and let's look at the perfect indicative forms, that is, in the active voice. And we see forms like capi, capisti, capit, capimus, capistis, and caperunt. Those are all formed from the perfect stem, which is capi, C-E-P-I. So those forms don't get an I in weird places either. So things formed from the present infinitive, things formed from the perfect stem, they don't get the letter I. But in the present tense, imperfect tense, and future, we do get the letter I wedged in there before all the personal endings. In the imperfect tense, active indicative, you get capiebam, capiebas, capiebot, capiebamus, capiebatis, capiebant. Okay, in the future tense, for a third conjugation verb, we're accustomed to just seeing the letter A for the first person singular. Rego, future first person singular, regam. Here with copio, we get an I there. We have copiam, copies, copiet. In the present subjunctive, we get an I and an A to give us forms like copiam, copias, copiat. Okay, so take some time to study this verb, this paradigm, and get accustomed to where that I shows up and where it doesn't. And probably what would be helpful is to compare it to rego. So if you're familiar with the paradigm for rego, and then you compare copio, that'll help you to discern where that extra I comes in. One last quick observation, in the present tense, indicative active, the different forms look pretty normal for a third conjugation verb, except in the first person singular, we have io, and the third person plural, you get iunt, copiunt. Take some time to study the paradigm. Take mental note of where the I is, where it's not, compared to the other third conjugation verbs you know, and that'll help you get familiar with these forms. Okay, let's move on now to section 250. Let's take a look at our new vocabulary for this lesson. First we have audacia, audacii. That's a feminine noun of the first declension. It means daring or boldness, and you may notice that it's related to our English word audacious. There's also a related Latin verb, audeo, which means to dare, not audio, to hear, but audeo. Next we have konatum, konati. That's a neuter noun of the second declension, and it means attempt or undertaking. There's also a related verb for that one, the verb conor, which we'll study later. Initium, initii, means beginning. That's a neuter noun of the second declension. Of course, we have lots of related English words like initial, initiation, things like that. Calamitas, calamitatis, a feminine noun of the third declension, means disaster or defeat. Of course, we have calamity in English. And now we have a whole slew of third declension IO verbs. The first of which is copio, capere, and it means to take. As always, you should make it a habit to memorize all four principal parts of every verb. If you only memorize the first principal part, copio, that doesn't tell you as much information. If you only memorize the first two principal parts, that gives you a bit more. But the best thing to do really is to set yourself up for future success by going ahead now and memorizing all four principal parts. Even if you don't feel like it, just go ahead and memorize them. Copio, capere, capi, coptum. And do that for every verb. Another thing that will really help you is when you memorize the four principal parts of a verb, try to do it with the correct pronunciation, with the accent on the correct syllable. Try to say long vowels long, short vowels short. If you do that, it will help you hear how the words sound. And as you hear yourself say the words correctly, you'll remember how they sound, and knowing the sound of them helps you remember the verb. So as you memorize these verbs, try to experience language in all the different ways that you can: reading, writing, listening, and speaking. Okay, you can copy out the different forms by hand. You can repeat them verbally. Again, when you do them verbally, try to pronounce them correctly, and that will help you to actually remember the forms. Also, when you're memorizing a noun, try to always memorize the nominative singular and the genitive singular. That way you know what the genitive stem is. I know it's tempting to take shortcuts and just memorize, part of something, but really you set yourself up for success later if you do more of the work now. So the next third conjugation IO verb that we have here is facio. This is an extremely common verb because it means to make or do. That's F-A-C-I-O, facio. If you've ever studied Spanish, that's where they get the verb hacer, H-A-C-E-R. If you've ever studied French, that's where the verb faire comes from, F-A-I-R-E. I'm sure there's a similar one in Italian. I've never studied Italian. So here are the four principal parts: facio, facere, faci, factum. Again, it means to make or do. So you'll see this verb used in conjunction with all kinds of different Latin nouns, Latin expressions, Latin idioms. And there's an important footnote here about the verb fio. That's F-I-O, fio. The verb facio doesn't have normal passive forms. Instead, it has a whole different verb to cover the passive forms of it. Facio means to make or do. In its passive form, it means to be made or to be done. And that meaning expressed is similar to what we have in English when we say the word become. Think of make or do as active, but become is sort of like the passive form of making something or doing something, because you're being made something or being done. And so if you want to say that something is being done, you don't change the endings of facio to be passive. Instead, you use an entirely different verb, which is fio. Okay, next we have yacio, yacere, yaki, yactum. That's a third conjugation I-O verb. That means to throw or hurl. The letter I that is found at the beginning of the various forms of this verb is what we call a consonantal I. In Latin, the letter I can be used two different ways. It can be used as a vowel or as a consonant. If something is used as a vowel, we call it vocalic. If something is used as a consonant, we call it consonantal. So the verb yacio has two I's in it. The first I is a consonantal I. It sounds sort of like ya. The second I, two letters from the end, is a vocalic I because it's a vowel. In Latin, consonantal I's tend to come into English as the letter J. So we see this root here, this Latin root, what comes into English as J-A-C. We see it embedded in lots of English words like eject, reject. You see it prefixed a lot with different prepositional prefixes. I think also project is this same root, but with the preposition pro on the front. Moving on, we have Parafficio, which, as you can see, is simply the verb facio with a prepositional prefix, which is per. Generally speaking, when you add the preposition per to the front of a verb, it intensifies it. It means to do it thoroughly. So facio means to do or make. Per facio means to do it thoroughly with the meaning of accomplishing it or finishing it or completing it. Okay, so when you take facio and you add per to the front of it, you get a vowel change. The A in facio turns into an I, and so you get perficio. Okay, so perficio means to finish, complete, or accomplish something. And so the four principal parts are perficio, perficere, perfeci, perfectum. Very similar to the principal parts of facio, except with an I instead of an A. This is the Latin verb from which we get our English word perfect. And that's why we say that the perfect tense describes completed action in past time, because the word perfect means completed or finished. These days in English, when we say that something is perfect, what we really mean is that it's really, really good. If someone tells me an idea and I say, hey, that's perfect, what I really mean is that it's just right. It has no flaws. There's nothing wrong with it. It's as good as it can be. So it's become sort of a synonym for fabulous or fantastic or something. So that's the way we use it in our language these days. But etymologically speaking, the idea of something being perfect means that it's completed. Okay, so the perfect tense, that word perfect there comes from the Latin that means completed or accomplished. And so that's why we say the perfect tense represents completed action in past time. Moving on, we have one last vocabulary item, and that's really just a phrase that involves facio. Again, facio means make or do. And so with the word iter, iter means march, journey, way, route, trip, all those kinds of things. So iter facio means to make a march or to do a march. And so we can simply translate it as march. Okay, let's move on to section 251. And in this section, we're going to study a new way to use the ablative. Well, it's new to us. It's not new to the ancient Romans. And this new way is called the ablative of manner. So we're going to use the ablative case in such a way that allows us to describe action. Okay, so we're going to make little phrases here that serve as adverbial phrases. You can have an adverb by itself, and you can use it to modify a verb or describe a verb. You can say, Sheila is walking quickly. Okay, and so the word quickly is an adverb. Or you can do it this way. You can say, Sheila is walking with great speed. So when you say with great speed, it's doing the exact same thing as the word quickly is doing. It's telling us how the action is occurring. Quickly is an adverb, and that tells us how the action is happening. With great speed is an adverbial phrase. And that adverbial phrase is functioning as an adverb. It's telling us how the action is occurring. Technically, the word with is a preposition. So if you say with great speed, it's, technically a prepositional phrase, but that phrase is functioning in an adverbial kind of way. It's an adverbial phrase. And that's what we're going to do here with Latin with the ablative case. So take a look here at section 251. We have the word audacia, which means boldness. And here with the word cum, we have a little phrase, cum audacia, with boldness. So for each line of text here, they want us to put it along with the verb opugnabant, which means they were attacking. So if we say opugnabant and then put cum audacia with it, it says they were attacking with boldness. Skip down to the bottom of the three where it says magna cum audacia. Okay, again, cum and audacia together says with boldness, but we have magna here. Why is magna first? Magna means great, and it goes with audacia. So that phrase means with great boldness. So why not say cum magna audacia, with great boldness? Well, the Romans just didn't want to do it that way. They wanted to put magna first to emphasize it. So they put magna before the preposition cum, and so you get magna cum audacia, with great boldness. You see that same kind of phrase at graduation when someone graduates magna cum laude or summa cum laude. So if we put together magna cum audacia and the verb opugnabant, we get they were attacking with great boldness. Now let's take a look at the middle one where it just says magna audacia. I think what the authors of the book are trying to point out here is that you don't necessarily need the word cum. Cum means with. So if you have cum plus the ablative, it literally says with boldness. But I think that grammatically speaking, you can do that even without the word cum, just with a straight, bare ablative like magna audacia. You can translate that as with great boldness. So with the word cum, without the word cum, it doesn't matter. Either way, it can be an ablative of manner describing the action, acting as an adverbial phrase. And again, in the middle one, magna audacia, notice that the adjective of size or quantity comes before the noun. Magna comes first, then audacia. Generally speaking, in Latin, adjectives come after the nouns they modify. But adjectives of size or quantity tend to come before the noun they modify. Okay, let's move on to page 92. And they're going to tell us a rule about ablatives of manner, which we were just now studying. It says here, Rule 20. The manner of an action is expressed by a noun in the ablative with cum if there is no modifying adjective, with or without cum if there is an adjective. So when we saw cum audacia, there was no adjective. It was just cum and then audacia. So we had the word cum there. But when we had the adjective magna, they gave it to us with the word cum and without the word cum. So what they're telling us here is that you can have an ablative of manner without the word cum if it has an adjective there. Okay, let's move on now to section 253. That's our translation section for this lesson. Go ahead and do all the exercises here. Turn off the recording, try to translate them on your own, and when you're done, turn the recording back on and we'll go over them together. Okay, hopefully by now you've completed your homework. Let's go through the exercises together. In exercise number 1, we have facimus, iacimus. Just a couple of verb forms here to practice with. In this lesson, we're working with third conjugation IO verbs, and so that's what we have here in this exercise. We have facimus, which is a form of the verb facio, which means to make or do. The vowel that we get before the personal ending is the letter I, just like any other third conjugation verb here in the present tense. So facimus means we do or we make. And iacimus is a form of the verb iacio, which means to throw. It also is present tense, first person plural, so it means we throw. So number 1 says we do or we make, and then we throw. Number 2, faciebatis, iacebatis. Again, we have a couple of verb forms to practice with. Both of these are imperfect tense. And it's the same verbs from number 1, facio and iacio. Notice here that we have the letter I coming before the letter E, and then we have the imperfect tense indicator, which is the BA, and then we have the personal ending. So notice the letter I here. Faciebatis is second person plural, imperfect tense, so it means y'all were making or y'all were doing. And then iacebatis means y'all were throwing. Moving on to number 3, we have faciemus and iaciemus. Again, just verb forms to practice with. These two happen to be future tense. We know that in the third conjugation, the letter E signals a future tense, right? But here, I think what the authors of the book would like us to notice is that we have the letter I before that letter E. So faciemus is first person plural future, so it means we will do or we will make. And then iaciemus means we will throw. Number 4, iaciunt, iacient. Here we have a present tense, iaciunt, which means they throw, and then we change the U to an E, and we get iacient, and that makes it future. So notice the letter I there in the future tense before the E. So number 4 says, they are throwing, they will throw. Number 5, tela iaciuntur. Okay, iaciuntur is passive. That's third person plural, present tense passive. So it means they are being thrown. And then the subject here is tela, which means projectiles, spears, javelins, darts, whatever you want to call it. So number 5 says, spears are being thrown, or javelins are being thrown. Number 6 is next. Konata perficientur. Okay, the verb here is perficientur. That's one of our new verbs for this lesson. It's the verb perficio, which means to finish, complete, or accomplish. It's really just the verb facio with the prefix per. Okay, so perficientur is third person plural, but it's passive. So it means they, and then there's passive activity of something being accomplished, but it's also future tense because we have the letter E there. If it were present tense, it would be perficiuntur. So you would have the letter U there, but instead we have an E, and so that indicates future tense. So perficientur says they will be accomplished, they will be finished, they will be completed. Okay, and what will be completed? Konata. Konatum is one of our new vocabulary words for this lesson. It means an attempt or a try. It's a neuter second declension noun. So if it's plural, nominative plural that is, it will be konata. So number 6 means something like the attempts will be completed or the attempts will be accomplished. Number 7 is next. Iter facitis. Okay, facitis is a form of the verb facio, which means to make or do or make. And it's second person plural, present tense. So it says, y'all are making or y'all are doing. And then we have the word iter here, which is the direct object of facitis. And so iter, in this context, means march. So number 7 literally says, y'all are doing a march, or y'all are making a march. But we can simply translate it as, y'all are marching. Number 8 is next. Facultas praedae faciendae. The word facultas was one of our new vocabulary words from last lesson. It means opportunity. And now we have a gerundive modifying praedae. So praedae is a noun that means booty, as in plunder. And then faciendae is a gerundive, otherwise known as a future passive participle. So facultas and praedae together would say an opportunity of booty or an opportunity of plunder. And then faciendae is a future passive participle of the verb facio, which means make or do. We can translate faciendae as to be made or to be done. That helps us in English to indicate that the action is future and it's done passively. And we can also use that to express necessity, that something needs to be done, must be done, or ought to be done. That's the flavor of meaning that usually accompanies a future passive participle. So number 8 literally says, an opportunity of plunder to be made, or an opportunity of plunder to be done. In English, that doesn't really say a whole lot. It's not very smooth English. So to translate it into English in a smoother way, we can take that passive activity described by faciendae and we can render it as active. We can say an opportunity of making. We can treat faciendae basically as if it were a gerund, that is translated as such. That's the first change we can do. The second change we can make is to make praedae as if it were the direct object of the action in the gerundive. So we can translate it as an opportunity of making plunder. Literally, it says an opportunity of plunder to be made, but we switch a couple of things around and say an opportunity of making plunder. Number 9 is next. Facultas per provinciam itineris faciendi. Here we have another gerundive, and again we have the word facultas, which means opportunity. Per provinciam means through the province. That's just a prepositional phrase here. And then we have itineris, which is the genitive singular form of iter, which means march, route, way, journey. And that's going to work along with facultas. So facultas and itineris together say an opportunity of a march or an opportunity of a journey. And then itineris has a gerundive modifying it. Okay, faciendi is a gerundive. It's also a genitive singular, and it's modifying itineris. And so faciendi means to be made or to be done. Okay, just like in the previous exercise, it's a gerundive of the verb facio, which means do or make. So itinerus and faciendi together say of a journey to be made or of a march to be made. So put the whole thing together and you get an opportunity of a march to be made through the province. Now, that translation I just gave actually makes sense in English. It makes sense to say an opportunity of a march to be made through the province. It's not the smoothest English ever, but at least it makes sense and it's understandable. So you could keep it just like that. However, you could smooth it out even further by doing our usual thing where we make the passive activity of the future passive participle active, and then we make the noun as if it were the direct object, as a translation trick. Okay, so what we could do is say an opportunity of making a march through the province. And when you say making a march or doing a march, what you really mean is just march, right? So we could even smooth it out even further by saying an opportunity of marching through the province. Okay, so I showed you the literal, word for word meaning, but then I showed you a couple of ways to smooth it out in your English translation. Number 10 is next. Filius ducis capiebatur. Okay, the subject here is filius. That's a second declension masculine noun that means son, S-O-N. And capiebatur is the verb. That's a form of the verb capio, which is one of our new verbs for this lesson. It's one of the third conjugation I-O verbs that we have been studying, and it means to take. Here you can tell by the BA part of the verb that this particular form is imperfect tense. When you have a little segment of a verb that you stick into the middle of it, that's called an infix, I-N-F-I-X, an infix. So you can tell by looking at the BA infix that this is imperfect tense, and then the personal ending, TUR, indicates that it's third person singular passive. So capiebatur says he, she, or it was being taken. Filius and capiebatur together say the son was being taken. Ducis is a form of the noun dux, that's D-U-X. That's a third declension noun that means leader. And so dux is nominative singular, ducis is genitive singular. So ducis means of the leader. Again, that's genitive. And so filius ducis says the son of the leader. So number 10 altogether says the son of the leader was being taken. Number 11 is next. Perficit. Okay, this is a present tense form of the verb perficio, which means to finish, complete, or accomplish. It's third person singular. So number 11 says he, she, or it is finishing, he, she, or it is completing. Just for the sake of learning, let me point out that if we changed one letter, we could turn this into a perfect tense verb. We could change the I, that is 4 letters from the end, and make it perfecit, and then it would be perfect tense, which would be he, she, or it accomplished, he, she, or it finished. But with the I there, perficit, it's present tense. Moving on to number 12. Facile est conata perficere. Okay, let's turn back for a quick moment to page 84, and let's do a quick review here. Section 230 at the top of page 84. It says uses of the infinitive. The infinitive is used chiefly as follows, without a subject. And then it says there as the subject of a finite verb, especially est or an impersonal verb. And they give an example sentence, expugnare oppidum est facile. Remember that there is no gerund in the nominative case. A gerund, which is a noun, only comes in genitive, dative, accusative, and ablative flavors. Okay, those are the only 4 cases you can have. They're neuter, singular forms from the second declension. Okay, if you want to have a nominative gerund, what you do is you use the infinitive. So in English, we would say, capturing the town is easy. We can just use a gerund there. But they don't have that gerund in Latin, so they use the infinitive, which is, to capture. So they say, to capture the town is easy. So basically, expugnare, this infinitive here, is functioning as the subject of the sentence. To capture, est facile, is easy. And then oppidum is the direct object of expugnare. And really, expugnare and oppidum together make a noun clause. And so expugnare oppidum, that sense unit or that grouping, really functions as the subject of the sentence in the form of a noun clause. To capture the town, that's the subject, and that's easy. To capture the town is easy. So facile here really ends up being a predicate adjective. And notice that facile is neuter, okay, because grammatically speaking, an infinitive, when it's used as a noun like that, it is grammatically neuter. So an infinitive has gender. An infinitive is neuter grammatically. Okay, so the subject here is expugnare, and so the predicate nominative, facile, has to be the same gender. It has to be neuter because the infinitive, grammatically speaking, is neuter. So the sentence says, to capture the town is easy. Now let's go back to our exercises on page 92, and let's look at this exercise, number 12. Facile est conata perficere. Okay, this sentence looks suspiciously like the one we just translated, or the one we just now reviewed. So we have an infinitive here, perficere, that means to accomplish, to finish, to complete. That's a present active infinitive, a form of Parafficio. So we can treat this like the subject of the sentence. We can say to finish or to complete, and then we have the verb is, est, and then we have facile. We can say to complete or to accomplish is easy. And conata, that's a form of one of our new words for this lesson. Konatum means an attempt. Here it's plural, and it's accusative plural because it's the direct object of perficere. So what we could do is say that perficere is the subject, and along with konata, it forms a noun clause. We could say to accomplish the attempts, or to accomplish the undertakings. That might be a better way to translate konata. To accomplish the undertakings, that little phrase makes a noun clause, and so we can treat that as the subject. Remember that when an infinitive is used as a noun, it's neuter grammatically. It's treated as neuter, and any adjective that modifies it or agrees with it must be neuter. And so facile is neuter. That's a third declension adjective. So we could say to accomplish the undertakings is easy. Or we could go with more of an impersonal kind of translation. Remember that an impersonal verb is a verb that makes kind of a general statement. There's no person specifically doing the action. For example, if I say it is raining, there's no person raining. It's just I'm stating the fact that raining is occurring. Rain is occurring. So in English, when we say it is raining, we could say that's an impersonal verb. And we can do that same thing here. We can say facile est. We could translate that as it is easy. And then we can have the infinitive to complete the undertakings. So we can say for number 12, it is easy to accomplish the undertakings. So you can do it that way, or you can say to accomplish the undertakings is easy. Either one of those captures what the Latin is saying. Number 13 is next. Populus Romanus pacem cum helvetiis faciet. Populus means people, as in a nation. Romanus is an adjective that means Roman. So populus Romanus means Roman people. And then faciet is a future tense verb. That's a form of facio, which means to do or make. So our subject and verb together says the Roman people will do or the Roman people will make. Pacem is the direct object of faciet. That means peace. That's the third declension noun pax, and here it's in the accusative singular. So the Roman people will make peace. And finally, we have a prepositional phrase, cum Helvetiis. That means with the Helvetii, with the Helvetians. So number 13 is pretty straightforward. The Roman people will make peace with the Helvetii. Number 14 is next. Hostes in agros finiti morum iter faciunt. Okay, the verb here is faciunt. That's a present tense form of the verb facio, which means to do or make. It's third person plural, so it means they are doing or they are making. The subject is hostes. That means enemies. It's plural. And so the subject and verb together say the enemies are doing or the enemies are making. The word iter is the direct object of faciunt. That's the third declension noun, which is neuter, and it means things like march, journey, road, way, trip. The nominative singular form is iter, and since it's neuter, the accusative singular form looks just like the nominative singular form. So iter is both nominative and accusative. Here it's accusative. So what that gives us is the enemies are making a march. We have a prepositional phrase, in agros. Ager is a second declension masculine noun that means field. It can also mean land or territory. And with the preposition in, taking the accusative, we can translate in as into. What we have so far says the enemies are making a march into the fields or into the lands or into the territories. Sometimes when you have a word like that that's plural, you can translate it, as a singular. You can say into the territory. The same thing with the word fines. If it says in fines, finis means border, but if it says into the borders, that's just a way of saying into someone's territory. So the feeling I get here from in agros is that it means into the land or into the territory. Finally, we have finiti morum. That's a form of the noun finitimus, which means neighbor. Here it's genitive plural, and so it means of the neighbors. And so in agros finiti morum says into the land of the neighbors or into the territory of the neighbors. The enemies are making a march into the territory of the neighbors. And we can throw in the word their, T-H-E-I-R, that is, because the idea is that the enemies are making a march into their neighbors' land. So we can, instead of saying into the territory of the neighbors, we can say into the territory of their neighbors. Okay, so in the answer key, you'll see the word their in parentheses because it's understood. Also, we can translate hostes, which means enemies, in a collective kind of way. We can say the enemy. And also we can take iter and faciunt together. Instead of saying make a march, we can just say march. Okay, so these are little ways that we can sculpt our translation to make it a bit smoother. So what we can do here is we can say the enemy is marching into the territory of their neighbors. Okay, that's not exactly literal. I've already mentioned the literal translation, but that translation includes a couple of standard ways of smoothing things out and making it more colloquial English. Number 15 is next. Hostes in nostros venientes tela jaciebant. Okay, this exercise is very similar to one from last lesson in which we talked about nostros, meaning our, in the sense of our troops. Okay, so this might look familiar. Again, we have the word hostes as the subject. That means enemies. And the verb is yakiebant. That's a form of the verb yakio, which means to throw or cast. This is imperfect tense, third person plural. So yakiebant says they were throwing. Again, the imperfect tense communicates continuous action in past time. So hostes yakiebant says the enemies were throwing. Okay, so what are they throwing? They're throwing tela. That word can mean missile, javelin, spear, anything that you can launch or throw as a projectile. We can translate it as javelin just for simplicity. And now we have to deal with in nostros venientes. As I mentioned in the last lesson, Julius Caesar in his Gallic Wars, he often talks about his own troops or his own soldiers with the word nostros. This is noster, which is a first and second declension adjective. Noster, nostra, nostrum. It means our, O-U-R. And he uses it as a substantive adjective. When he says our, he means our guys, our troops, our soldiers. So nostros here is accusative plural, and it's being used with the preposition in. As you know, the preposition in can mean in or on when it takes the ablative. When it takes the accusative, it can mean into, and it can also mean against. And so here, it's taking the accusative case, and so it's going to mean something like against or into. So what we have so far would say the enemies were throwing javelins into our guys, into our soldiers, into our troops, or perhaps you could say against our troops, or maybe even at our troops. It's hard to directly capture the wording here in English. And then we have a participle modifying nostros. We have the fourth conjugation verb venio, which means come. And so venientes is a present participle of the verb venio. Okay, so it means coming, and it's parked right next to the word nostros. So what it looks like to me is that nostros and venientes go together. So number 15 would say something like this. The enemies were throwing javelins into our troops coming. And here's an example of a place where we might need to add a word or two in to help communicate what's going on here. The idea is that, the Roman troops are coming in the sense of coming toward the enemies. Like sometimes in English we say oncoming. Like if a car is coming at you, you might say it's an oncoming car. Or if the traffic is coming toward you, you might say it's oncoming traffic. So from the enemy's perspective, the Roman troops are coming at them. And so they're venientes, they're coming toward them. And so the enemies were throwing javelins at those oncoming Roman soldiers. So the idea here is the enemies were throwing javelins into our oncoming soldiers. Technically speaking, we could put venientes with hostes. We could say the enemies coming were throwing javelins into our troops. But that doesn't make as much sense because venientes is parked right next to nostros. And so that makes me want to read nostros along with venientes. So if we think of a formation of Roman soldiers and then the enemies throwing javelins into that formation, that's the idea of in nostros, into our troops. Also, we can treat hostes as a collective, as just the enemy. So for number 15, we could say this. We could say the enemy was throwing javelins into our coming troops. That's a pretty decent way to render it. Okay, let's move on to number 16. Hic locus ex calamitate populi Romani nomen capiet. Let's take a look at the verb. We have capiet, which is a form of the verb capio. That's one of our new third conjugation IO verbs for this lesson. And capio means to take. Here we have a future tense form. It's third person singular. So capiet says he, she, or it will take. The subject is locus, which means place, and it's being modified by hic. As you can see, the footnote says that hic means this. In this particular context, hic is a demonstrative adjective, so we'll read it along with locus, and it'll say this place. Hic locus and capiet together will say this place will take. And then we have the direct object nomen. Nomen is a third declension neuter noun that means name. Nomen here could be nominative singular or accusative singular. Because it's neuter, those two forms look the same. For neuter nouns in Latin, accusative and nominative always look the same. Nomen is not nominative, though. It's actually accusative. It's the direct object of capiet. So far that gives us this place will take a name. We have a prepositional phrase, ex calamitate. Ex means out of or from, and calamitate is a form of the noun calamitas. That means disaster. Here it's ablative singular because it's the object of the preposition ex. We can simply translate ex here as from. So far that gives us this place will take a name from the disaster. And then Populi Romani means of the Roman people. That's genitive. So what this exercise is saying is that somehow a disaster in battle will be associated with a geographical place, that place will somehow get its name from that military disaster. Nomen can also mean things like, reputation. So it could be saying this place will get its reputation from the disaster of the Roman people. Sort of like in English when we say something like, I'm going out to make a name for myself. It doesn't mean you're actually making a name for yourself. You already have a name. What you're saying there is you want to go out and make a recognizable name or a well-known name. In other words, a reputation. So that could be the flavor of what is being said here. But as far as a literal translation goes, what we can say is this. This place will take a name from the disaster of the Roman people. Also, we can throw in the word its, that's its, without an apostrophe, and say that the place will take its name, okay? Because that's what's being inferred here. That's the understood meaning of it. So for our final translation here, we'll say, this place will take its name from the disaster of the Roman people. Number 17 is next. Liscus magno cum periculo id faciebat. Okay, the verb here is faciebat. That's a form of facio, one of our new verbs for this lesson. It's a third conjugation io verb. That means do or make. Here it's imperfect tense, third person singular. So faciebat says he, she, or it was doing, or he, she, or it was making. And the subject here is Liscus. That's a person's name. Okay, so Liscus was doing, or Liscus was making. That's what we have so far. And we have id here as our direct object. Id is a form of is ea id. We studied that a few lessons ago. Is ea id can be a demonstrative adjective, or it can be a demonstrative pronoun. Here it's acting as a pronoun. Id is the neuter form, and so because it's neuter, we can translate it as it. So we can say Liscus was doing it. We don't know what it is, but whatever it was, Liscus was doing it. And then we have magno cum periculo. Cum periculo is a prepositional phrase. Cum means with. Periculo is a form of the second declension neuter noun periculum, which means danger. And magno is thrown in there as part of the phrase. So magno cum periculo means with great danger. This is an example of an ablative of manner. So we could translate it as Lycus was doing it with great danger. That doesn't really make a whole lot of sense in English. If you look up the word periculum, you'll find that it can also mean things like risk. So here, it might be better to translate it as risk, and we could say Lycus was doing it with great risk. Magno cum periculo, that's an ablative of manner, and when you add those three words up, it creates an adverbial phrase, a little phrase that acts as an adverb. It's telling you how the action in the sentence was happening. So if you want to say how the action in a sentence is happening, you can use an adverb or an adverbial phrase. Either way, you're saying how that action was happening. Number 18 is next. Mons a nostris celeriter capitur. The verb here is capitur. That's a form of the verb capio, one of our new verbs for this lesson. It's a third conjugation io verb. Here it's present tense. Notice the I before the personal ending. And the personal ending tells us that it's third person singular passive. So capitur says something like, he, she, or it is being taken. The subject here is mons. That's a third declension noun that means mountain. So the subject and verb together say, the mountain is being taken. Celeriter is an adverb that means quickly. So the mountain is being taken quickly. And then finally we have an ablative of agent, a nostris. Whenever you have a passive verb in Latin, you have action that's being experienced passively by somebody or something, but then you can use the preposition a or ab to say by whom the action is being done. A nostris means by our. That's a substantive adjective, nostris. So it means our men, our troops, our soldiers. You have to throw in the understood word there. So a nostris means by our troops, by our men, by our soldiers, something like that. So for number 18, we can say the mountain is quickly being taken by our men. One quick observation before we go, instead of celeriter, which is an adverb meaning quickly, we could throw in an ablative of manner. There's the noun celeritas, which means speed. So we could say cum celeritate with speed instead of celeriter. So mons a nostris cum celeritate capitur. So whether we use an adverb, celeriter, to mean quickly, or an ablative of manner, cum celeritate, to mean with speed, either way, it's an adverbial kind of statement that's describing the action. My point here is that an adverb and an adverbial phrase, such as an ablative of manner, do the same thing. Number 19 is next. Helvetiis facultas per provinciam itineris faciendi non datur. Okay, the verb is datur. That's a form of the first conjugation verb do, which means give. Do, dare, dedi, datum. Those are the four principal parts. The verb do is mostly regular, but it does have a few irregularities. So it's slightly irregular, but a mostly regular first conjugation verb. So datur is present tense, third person singular, passive. So datur says he, she, or it is being given. It's being negated by the word non. So non datur says he, she, or it is not being given. And the subject here is facultas, which means opportunity. That's a fairly recent vocabulary word for you. So facultas, non, and datur together will say an opportunity is not being given. Helvetiis is dative plural. That's showing the recipient or beneficiary of the giving. So we'll translate that as to the Helvetii or to the Helvetians. Okay, so what we have so far says an opportunity is not being given to the Helvetii. Now let's look at itineris and faciendi. Okay, itineris is the third declension noun iter, which means march, journey, road, or way, and it's genitive singular. So that's going to be working along with facultas. So facultas and itineris will say something like the opportunity of a march. Faciendi is a gerundive, otherwise known as a future passive participle, and it's modifying itineris. Itineris and faciendi both are genitive singular. We can translate faciendi as to be done. Okay, the action is passive, it's in the future, and there's the feeling that it needs to be done, must be done, or ought to be done. So facultas, itineris, and faciendi will say this: an opportunity of a march to be made. Finally, we have per provinciam, that means through the province. That's the Roman province in the south of France. So put it all together, and we have an opportunity of a march to be made through the province is not being given to the Helvetii. Okay, so let's now apply our usual fix-ups, our usual ways of smoothing out the translation. For our future passive participle, we can treat it as though it's active, kind of like a gerund. We can say an opportunity of making, and then we can treat itineris as if it's the direct object of that action. So we can say of making a march. Okay, that's not literally what the Latin says, but we do it as a way to smooth out the English translation and make it say something in English. Okay, so what that would give us is an opportunity of making a march through the province is not being given to the Helvetii. Finally, we can take itineris and faciendi together, and instead of saying make a march, we can just translate it as march. So here's what we can do. An opportunity of marching through the province is not being given to the Helvetii. Number 20 is next. Magna cum virtute, bellum gerunt. Okay, the verb here is gerunt. That's a form of the verb gero, which means to bear or carry, and it's third person plural, present tense. So gerunt says they are bearing or they are carrying. There is no separate noun to be the subject, so we'll need to just say they as the subject. So the subject and verb are they are carrying or they are bearing. The direct object is bellum, which means war. That's accusative singular. So it says they are bearing war. But when we see the noun bellum along with the verb gero, we can translate it as to wage war. Bellum gerunt here can say they are waging war. And then we have an ablative of manner. Magna cum virtute. Cum means with. Virtute is a form of the noun virtus. That's a third declension noun that means manliness or valor or bravery. Cum virtute says with valor. And then we have magna here modifying virtute. So it's with great valor. Again, for emphasis, the Romans liked to put adjectives of size or quantity first. So we have magna cum virtute. Just like at graduation, when someone graduates summa cum laude or magna cum laude, same exact phrasing. Okay, so for number 20, we can say, they are waging war with great valor. Number 21 is next. Una Galliae pars initium capit a flumine rodano. Okay, the verb here is capit. That's a form of the verb capio, one of our new verbs for this lesson. It's a third conjugation io verb. So capit is present tense, and it means he, she, or it takes, or he, she, or it is taking. And the word pars is the subject. That means part. So part is taking, or a part is taking. That's the skeleton of the sentence. Una is modifying pars, so it says one part. And then Galliae is genitive. and it's possessing the pars. Una Gallii pars says one part of Gaul. The genitive Gallii is sandwiched between una and pars. Very common Roman word order. Okay, so what we have so far says one part of Gaul takes, or one part of Gaul is taking. Initium is the direct object of capit. Initium is a second declension neuter noun that means beginning. Okay, so one part of Gaul takes a beginning. That's basically what's being said here. Now we have a flumine. A means from, and flumine is the ablative singular form of flumen, which is a third declension noun that means river. Flumen is a neuter. So a flumine means from the river. And then we have the name of the river, Rodano here. That means Rhone, R-H-O-N-E. That's a river in France. So a flumine Rodano says from the Rhone River. So 21 literally says one part of Gaul takes a beginning from the Rhone River. So that's how the words add up, that it takes a beginning. But as you can see, there's a footnote here. Footnote 2 says, initium capit a, that is, it takes a beginning from. That's just a Roman way to say that something begins at a place. So literally, 21 says, one part of Gaul takes a beginning from the Rhone River, but a much smoother translation would be, one part of Gaul begins at the Rhone River. Okay, that's it for this lesson. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time in Lesson 31.